Story 1. The music, pre-social media, freedom of being a latchkey kid, be home before the streetlights come on, and the simplicity of pre-technology times, aided by early unobtrusive technology, getting lost and finding our way back. I'm unsure how to express it. MTV was MTV. Playing with the kid you disliked down the street because you needed even teams in whatever the neighborhood was playing. There were no pharmaceutical advertisements. Society seemed more cohesive, and people appeared more connected. Perhaps that's my younger self being naive. The personal connection, the disconnection, and the lack of constant input. There is some repetition here, but you understand. Story 2. It was the end of the Cold War. The world had averted nuclear disaster without major conflict. Standards of living were rising, and life expectancy was increasing. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s had the stock market rising at 30% per year for several years. Regular people felt like they were getting ahead in life. Technology was advancing, and the world seemed to have evolved without conflict, which was unprecedented. Story 3. Honestly, I think it's because the 1990s were the last decade where life felt both connected and unplugged. We had just enough technology, landlines, cable television, and early internet to feel modern, but not so much that it overwhelmed daily life. You could disappear for hours without anyone worrying. No smartphones tracking your every move and no pressure from social media. Music felt more personal, too. You had to hunt for albums, make mixtapes, or burn CDs. There was something magical about discovering music on your own, not just from algorithms. Plus, the world felt slower. You lived more in the moment, even if it was just hanging out with friends, biking around, or watching television on a Friday night. The nostalgia hits hard because life now is always on, and the 1990s gave us space to just be. Story 4. Not having smartphones allowed people to disconnect, even if only for a little while. Social media had not reached a point where we compared our daily lives to everyone else's edited highlight reels. Story 5. It was a perfect blend of how our parents grew up and how our children would grow up. We played outside without the internet or cell phones, and just as we reached early adulthood, technology began to emerge and we adapted easily. Story 6. We came of age in the 1990s. We learned to drive, graduated high school, went to college, had parties, and explored the world around us, both nearby and far away. We did these things without the help of the internet or the pressures of social media. It is almost impossible for someone to comprehend what that felt like, and it is an experience that is very difficult to replicate in any meaningful way in this digital world. The drugs were not all laced with fentanyl, allowing us to experiment without the risk of instant death that exists today. It was not safe by any means, but it is crazy how different things are now. Story 7. It was a moment in time when youth culture was a mix of cynicism and distrust of shallowness and excessive behavior, while also being hesitantly optimistic about the future. The Cold War was finally over, the economy wasn't in complete disarray, and we were witnessing significant leaps in technology happening before our eyes. The world had opened up, making experiences like attending college and meeting exchange students from East Germany or the former Soviet Union much more common. They could share firsthand accounts of life in their countries. We were the last generation to experience life before the internet became a dominant force, both for good and bad, making it a remarkable time to be young. We witnessed the emergence of many things that current youth consider fundamental in their lives and saw them develop and evolve over the next 30 years. We are keenly aware that many of these are not actually necessities. Rather, they are luxuries or conveniences, as we remember what life was like without them. I always thought it must have been somewhat similar to how my grandmother transitioned from living without electricity to seeing her first automobile, to having a phone in her home, to flying to Europe on vacation as a senior citizen, to using video applications on a cell phone to talk to me while I was in graduate school in the early 2000s shortly before she passed away. I can't fathom what her life was like before cars, television, phones, and other conveniences existed. Just as today's youth may struggle to understand what life was really like in the 1990s and earlier. Story 8. No social media, no cell phones, no hyper-radicalized politics, and much less government surveillance. You could live next to someone for decades and never know about their political affiliation. If you needed a break, you could simply go for a walk or get in your car, And as far as the rest of the world was concerned, you might as well be on the moon. If they wanted you for something, they just had to wait until you came back. And making people wait was completely acceptable behavior. If politics was too overwhelming, you could avoid reading the newspaper until you were ready to engage with it again. You could travel on trains or airplanes without a stranger checking for concealed items. When you left work, you never had to think about it again until you returned the next time. You had much more control over your life and relaxation, and that was normal. Disappearing for a day without picking up your phone would now cause people to react as if you had committed a serious offense. Story 9. A world before the internet and before September 11th, 2001, is so different that nobody under 30 really understands it. I bought a plane ticket with cash and flew across the country without showing anyone any identification. When I pulled out a cigarette to smoke on the flight, I noticed I had accidentally brought a live .22 round on the plane with me. This was 1993. Story 10. Attending relatively inexpensive concerts, joking around, and feeling connected with people who weren't glued to their phones was a refreshing experience. I noticed girls wearing wide-leg pants. Most attendees appeared quite happy and optimistic about the future. I felt a sense of relief almost immediately when Bill Clinton was elected. George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan had a way of bringing down the mood and seemed intent on returning to the past. Soundgarden. Story 11. You had to wait for everything and let the excitement build up until you were red in the face before you could experience it. Somehow, instant gratification makes everything seem pointless. Story 12. Adults miss being young and carefree. The world felt a lot freer then without social media and smartphones. No one expected to talk to you at any given time. You wouldn't have people wanting to know what you were doing at random moments. These days, I feel like we are constantly being watched. Additionally, the sense of impending doom seemed much less prevalent. We had just emerged from the Cold War, and it felt like things were going to be good again. Famous last words, I suppose. Story 13. Parties on the roof of my apartment in the East Village, art school, dive bars, $1 slices, independent bands on the jukebox, clove cigarettes, great drugs that are fentanyl-free, matte mauve lipstick, and Pumas. No phones, no computers connected to the rest of the world. Missed connections and just hanging out, enjoying conversation on a Saturday night. Story 14. The explosion of new art marked a new phase of popular culture. Music included grunge, Britpop, nu metal, rap, boy bands, girl bands, and dance. Films featured many noteworthy titles. In sports, there was the iconic heavyweight division in boxing, Alex Ferguson's Manchester United in England, the 1994 FIFA World Cup in the United States, Tiger Woods' emergence, Formula One going mainstream, and South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup after the end of apartheid. Video games saw the introduction of groundbreaking consoles like PlayStation and Nintendo 64 with classic games. Television offered shows like Twin Peaks, The Simpsons, The X-Files, and later, The Sopranos. For many, the Monday Night Wars in professional wrestling were a highlight of the 1990s. Truly was an incredible decade for entertainment and culture. Story 15. I was a kid in the 1990s. I miss biking to my friend's house, throwing my bike on the lawn, and barging in since we didn't lock doors back then. I would yell, "Hi, Mrs. Hall, where's Mike?" Then I would find him in the basement playing Nintendo 64 with the other boys. Good times. Story 16. It never felt like I had to pay for every second of existence as it does now. I could miss a day of work without choosing which meals to skip in order to afford rent. Story 17. The government functioned better. Then we became overly concerned about terrorism and wasted money on wars in the Middle East while granting significant tax cuts to the wealthy. We have never recovered from this. As a result, the government has been unable to provide for its citizens, leading to a further erosion of faith in the government. This culminates in a movement characterized by a blend of fascism aimed at traditional targets such as liberals and minorities, as well as the concept of a deep state and federal employees. Story 18. The internet offered hope. September 11th had not stained everyone's souls. The greatest generation was still alive. People remembered the great wars, and there was a global sense of not wanting to repeat them. Climate change was still perceived as a future concern. Russia appeared to want to be part of the world. There had not been 30 years of constant social auditing that made everyone resentful. There were no billionaires, and there was far less concentration of wealth among the top 1%. Corporations were not considered people and could not fund politicians with millions of dollars. Story 19. Life was simpler, and everything was not on demand. You actually had to wait to watch a television show and interact with people in real life. The fake virtual online life did not exist. The most interaction online was from AOL chat. Story 20. $125,000 houses were really nice. No social media dividing us. I could still somewhat believe the news. The Patriot Act wasn't an issue. Story 21. People were not constantly online, allowing them to relax and connect with others, even when they had differing opinions. Often, individuals were unaware of their disagreements because they were not arguing with family members online all the time. The internet is likely the most significant factor contributing to this change. It was useful for certain tasks without being as pervasive as it is today. Story 22. I miss everything about it. The music, the attitude, the 1990s. You had to live it to understand what an incredible time it was and the hope people had for the future. However, the year 2000 arrived like a wrecking ball. Story 23. It was the perfect mix of analog and digital. The internet was a cool new tool, not anyone's master. Technology made listening to music and watching movies a little easier without overwhelming us with choices. The economy was in good shape, and we were in a golden age of television sitcoms and cartoons. Life was good. Story 24. Before cell phones became widely available, social media and technology were already trying to grab your attention around the clock. Story 25. The economy was much better during the dot-com rise. There was a distinct musical genre for the time in grunge, and many bands that would become future megastars were just getting started. There was no social media, and the internet was still in its 1.0 configuration, resulting in far less toxicity and more exploration of the new digital frontier. There were no major wars being fought, and domestically, there did not seem to be significant social struggles. It felt to most that the biggest issues of racism and sexism were behind us, and the work ahead was simply focused on achieving equal pay and anti-discrimination laws. In short, things genuinely felt like they were getting better. Then the 2000 election happened, and we entered a darker period. Story 26. Kids had much more freedom back then, at least where I grew up. In the summer, we left in the morning and didn't return home until the streetlights turned on. Story 27. I think people are generally nostalgic for the time periods when they were children, teenagers, or young adults, and millennials and Generation X experienced those ages in the 1990s. However, I don't think older individuals, like my 70-year-old mother, are especially fond of the 1990s compared to other decades. She often talks more about the 1960s and 1970s. Story 28. The internet was barely a thing and smartphones did not exist. These two developments changed society profoundly. Story 29. I was able to work a $12.50 per hour job with health insurance that covered not only rent, but also an entertainment budget. I worked my 40 hours and then spent the rest of my time clubbing, attending shows for amazing bands that cost between $5 and $10, visiting art galleries and openings, and enjoying endless house parties and camping or beach trips with large groups of friends. Life didn't cost so much, so we had more time and funds to truly enjoy things. We didn't have cell phones to document all our mistakes, which allowed us to make them and learn from them. Politics weren't such a divide. We definitely had differences between party affiliations, but we could still have family dinners with our grandparents, aunts, and uncles without those topics being brought up. I once brought my roommate to Thanksgiving in 1998 with my very Christian conservative family. I was goth, he was punk with blue and green hair, and a middle finger patch on his jeans, which we both kind of forgot about. They accepted him as one of us and were very impressed by his ability to eat. There was a feeling of hope for the future and a sense of community that we don't have anymore. Story 30. Because the economy was good, there was hope for the future. The television, movies, and music were enjoyable, and there were no social media platforms or smartphones. Story 31. I'm a bit late to the party here, but I figured I'd chime in. Firstly, I'm biased, since I'm Generation X. The 1990s were young adulthood for us, so everything was considered better. For me, this included high school graduation, college, meeting and marrying my spouse, and getting my first real job that came with real money. This age is always seen as better for whatever generation is going through it. From the world's perspective, the Iron Curtain was falling or had fallen. The threat of nuclear destruction, which was a real fear in my childhood, was suddenly gone. Russia was making moves to join the world community. The internet became available to the general public. It was an optimistic time. It brought people together from across the world who had never been able to easily communicate before. I literally downloaded files from Australia to North America. I texted and chatted for free with a friend who was half a continent away when a long-distance call would have been expensive for a student like me. Climate change wasn't recognized yet, and the events of September 11th had not happened, so general optimism was everywhere. From the United States perspective, the economy was booming. The Clinton administration managed to maintain a surplus for 8 years. The government was generally still functional. The two parties had traditions and decorum that allowed them to accomplish things, even when they disagreed. Politicians still crossed the aisle without being permanently blacklisted from their party. The large broadcasting conglomerates of today didn't exist, so unified messaging was nearly impossible. Overall, the world seemed to be moving in a good, more or less peaceful direction. In fact, the farthest from midnight that the doomsday clock has ever been was in 1991, when it was 17 minutes before. Currently, it sits at 89 seconds. Story 32. Post-Cold War and pre-September 11. It didn't feel like the world was coming to an end. It also seems like it was the last decade to have its own distinct identity. It had many good shows and movies that remain iconic. Additionally, those of us who remember it were younger and healthier. Life was full of possibilities, and our futures seemed bright. The worst thing a president did was deny that he had sexual relations with that woman. Oh, and The Simpsons was excellent. Story 33. I explained Blockbuster Video to my girlfriend's 8-year-old son this past weekend. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. I showed him 2 video tours, and I explained that everyone would go there on Friday or Saturday night. You could run into your friends and you could rent video games. I explained that if you missed it in the theater, you might have to wait months, which would build anticipation and make it more special. There were very few on-demand options besides pay-per-view and later renting movies on demand. I said it would help you appreciate things more, but he thought it seemed inconvenient. Then I explained that if I just gave everything to his little sister every time she asked for it, she would be spoiled, and he agreed. Finally, I said, "We're all kind of spoiled now." Story 34. You would find something to do or think if you were bored. If nothing was on television, you might watch something you didn't really want to, and maybe discover something you didn't know you liked. If you rented a video game and found it too challenging, you had to keep playing because that was the game you had for 2 days before it was due back. If you didn't know something, like who was in a particular movie, you would have to figure it out or not. There was no using your phone for trivial questions. Story 35. Here is what was not in the 1990s. The September 11th attacks, the banking crisis and Great Recession, COVID-19, the controversy surrounding Donald Trump as president, unaffordable real estate, and toxic internet culture. It was a simpler time. Story 36. Arguably the best 10 years of music history include the rise and peak of pop-punk, the golden years of grunge, and the golden era of hip-hop. There were also amusing and enjoyable niche genres like rap rock and bro rock, similar to yacht rock represented by bands such as Sister Hazel and Gin Blossoms. Story 37. They were young, and the world felt new and exciting with fewer responsibilities. This is the case for every generation. Story 38. You could be a successful musician and unattractive in the 1990s, going to concerts where people only take a few pictures instead of recording the entire event. Story 39. Millennials often explore and discover things on their own. Was it risky? Yes, but it was worthwhile as you learned through experience. This was especially true when playing games outdoors. Story 40. The feeling of modernity without the overconnectedness of today is refreshing. You had exciting technology emerging, but you still needed to go out to experience it. If you wanted to play games with your friends, you had to meet up and play together. While things are certainly more convenient now, there was something enjoyable about the necessity of interacting with people. Story 41. There was a collective, albeit sarcastic optimism that the world was improving and an ethical renaissance, if not possible in our lifetimes, would happen soon after. Then it all seemed to deteriorate in about 10 months. We were unaware of the number of complete failures quietly living among us. Story 42. I'm tired of everything nowadays being a commercial for something. There were just fewer ads in the 1990s media space. Story 43. In the late 1990s, I was 21 years old, making $600 a week. My rent as a roommate in a two-bedroom apartment with one other person was $250 a month, all inclusive. Story 44. Yes, the before times. Before Bush Jr. damaged the economy to start a two-front war in Asia for oil and to give the entire treasury to military contractors. The economy was thriving and I had a great job. Concerts were affordable, and there were 5 outdoor music festivals every summer. Story 45. The internet was still new, creative, and fun. Social media did not exist. Cable news was present, but it was not as saturated in daily life. Cell phones were still expensive in the early to mid-1990s, limiting availability. Usage was also costly until the late 1990s. Story 46. As a kid who turned 8 in 1990, everything seemed so positive. We won the Cold War and then went on to defeat Iraq with our allies in the Gulf War. America had no serious threats against it. We had won. Cable television meant more programming than ever, much of it aimed directly at younger viewers. The movies being released were amazing, and music was evolving dramatically every few years. We were at a balance where the Generation X latchkey kid style of parenting was fading. Parents became more involved with their children and wanted them to be happy, yet there was still a significant amount of freedom given to kids to do their own things. Then, later in the 1990s, the internet emerged. I could go on instant messaging platforms and talk to other kids all over the world. I made friends I would talk to every day after school, and we knew more about each other than many of my friends in real life. I could spend 3 hours downloading a Metallica audio file only to find out it was actually Pantera, but I could still do it without having to go to a record store. Gas was so inexpensive. When I started driving, it was under $1 per gallon. We would load up a beat-up car with 6 teenagers and cruise around, smoking cigarettes and blasting music. The car cost less than $800, and when something broke, it was fixable with a shop manual and a trip to a salvage yard. As kids, we would ride bikes from house to house, but when one of us got a car, we would drive. Sometimes we would just drive around without a destination because we were all broke, but we could still scrape together $10 to fill the gas tank. Being in the car with friends was often better than being at home with our parents. Jobs were relatively easy to find because it was the time when you could walk in and fill out an application. If the manager had a good feeling about you, you were hired. It all felt like not much was happening, but we were moving in the right direction. Story 47. It was the 1990s. Story 48. To be clear, the mid to late 1990s featured minimal internet and maximum prosperity. Great movies and diverse generational music emerged across numerous genres. There was freedom from surveillance, the innocence of a pre-September 11 world, and most importantly, no social media. Story 49. Less technology. Now, I love technology and adore it. However, I know that the internet and my phone can be as much a curse as a blessing. As great as the internet is, it can sometimes feel like a cesspool and creates nightmare scenarios for privacy and misinformation. I turned 18 around the year 2000, so we still had the internet, but it wasn't what it is today. As for cell phones, I never had one until around 2003 to 2005. There was a simple freedom in not having one. The combination of both made the late 1990s and early 2000s feel a bit more liberating. Story 50. It was the last genuine and organic decade. After that, everything became heavily sanitized corporate nonsense, and every decade has largely been the same since the 2000s. Story 51. There has been a constant stream of fearmongering and acts to isolate minorities since September 11th. We have been bombarded with propaganda and rhetoric to make us suspicious that someone else would get a better deal than we would and take what we have worked hard for. And it worked. We had all the enjoyment of the 1980s, plus a sense of optimism and increasing global awareness, and then we had it all taken away. Everything is becoming increasingly corporate and cold. Everything is moving to subscription models, so we lose ownership of things we paid for. And there is nothing we can do about it. We have lost our privacy, our basic human rights, and our future is being plundered as we speak. Because of our years of isolation, we are too divided to put up any sort of resistance. There is a reason the Matrix chose the end of the 20th century. It was the last breath of fresh air we were allowed. Story 52. Youth. The 1990s were a time before September 11th, before COVID-19, and after the Vietnam War. There were many changes, including social acceptance and ongoing advancements in technology. I attended college to learn software applications, only for those applications to become outdated by the time I graduated. I do not miss the 1990s very much, but it was a period of growth and possibilities. Story 53. It was a generally calm decade in North America. Things seemed to be getting better, with early internet optimism and no ongoing conflicts. Story 54. Look up dance clubs from the 1990s to see how much fun people were having. If you were bored, you had to go out and interact with others. People were more accustomed to strangers talking to them. Life was yours. Story 55. The collective quality of everything being released, related to music, television, film, and the overall entertainment world, seemed to have a much better balance. We had not yet reached the point of expected instant gratification. There was much more value and quality to life overall. Story 56. It was better. Life was easier. The music was better. The sports were better. The movies were better. Comedy was better. I was there in my early 20s, and it is undeniably true. Story 57. I was in my 20s, using MDMA and attending exciting parties, spending time with my creative friends and exploring the world. Everyone around me was supportive. I had a successful company in the entertainment industry, and with so much money and opportunity, I accidentally started a second business in a related field. I purchased a house outright. I learned to fly. Yes, the 1990s. I've been struggling ever since. Story 58. My nights at my mother's house with friends were filled with listening to Nirvana. We couldn't dance, but we had fun without a phone recording everything. Story 59. We were able to mess up without it haunting us forever. There were cameras, but not cell phones. So if someone took a picture of you drunk with a drawing on your forehead, it was laughed at and then buried in a box of photos under the bed for the next 30 years. Story 60. No constant connection to everything and everyone at all times. Anticipation. Everything is at your fingertips now and streamable. Remember having to wait a full week for the next episodes of your favorite shows to air? Or not having access to game cheats and modifications instantly? Additionally, regarding video games, you used to buy the complete game without microtransactions or day one downloadable content. Story 61. Before September 11th, promising technology and the early days of the internet allowed movies to have plots, and music to be recorded and performed by musicians. We used to call it hanging out. It was a time when you and other people, known as friends, would gather in one physical location and talk to each other face to face, without the assistance of devices. Let me know if I'm going too fast. Story 62. Everything felt positive. Teenage culture was thriving, and it was good to be young. It felt safer, as we didn't have every little bit of neighborhood news in our hands, giving our parents paranoia. The roads weren't as busy, so kids were safe to cross them. There was more diversity on television, and it didn't feel forced. My favorite television shows after school were Sister, Kenan and Kel, Moesha, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, My Wife and Kids, and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, mostly featuring black families, and it was just not a big deal. Not having social media was the best. Imagine getting bullied at school and it being filmed. Someone said that Generation Z doesn't dance and let loose in nightclubs as much as millennials do because they don't want to be filmed looking awkward. It's a shame. I do like Generation Z. They have a good sense of humor, and I hope the world gets its act together for you all. Story 63. The significant point for Generation X is that, for the most part, we were younger. For instance, those were my 20s. College, graduation, first big jobs, falling in love, and getting married. In that mix was the music. It was a delightful blend of British pop, grunge, indie rock, and rap. It felt like every time you turned around, there was a new band, song, or scene. We were young, out of our parents' house, in love, and enjoying amazing music. That made it magical. Story 64. We were much freer. Social media was non-existent and just a fun novelty. We weren't beholden to our phones. This was also before September 11th, and there was a lot of optimism. Story 65. Back then, new music was released on a Tuesday. We had a record store that we knew received the CDs the Friday prior. We would visit that Friday and ask for the CD, and they would sell it to us. We enjoyed a full weekend of playing the CD before the public had access to it. A special thanks to the Vault in Danbury, Connecticut. Story 66. The 1990s were the last time that the world seemed relatively at peace. The Cold War ended in 1989, and the War on Terror did not begin until 2001. Things felt, for the first time in my life, fairly calm. Story 67. Drugs were high quality, and you weren't playing Russian roulette with them. The music was and still is the best ever made. Grunge, rap, funk, jam band, and country was still country. There was no social media. Nobody had their identity wrapped up in the person they voted for. Nobody cared if you were Republican or Democrat. It was before the food supply deteriorated significantly. You weren't connected all the time. Europe was amazing and affordable to travel through. Television and movies were impressive. It was the last of original content creation. There were no reboots with new casts or political agendas, except for The West Wing. Germany was united. The Cold War was over. We had won. We became somewhat friendly with Russia. All the drills we did growing up, preparing for bomb shelters, were no longer necessary. We were optimistic about the future. We made it to adulthood without ever having to stop, drop, and roll, as if we might spontaneously combust at any moment. Then September 11th happened, and the world we knew and the future we hoped for was over. Story 68. People weren't staring at their phones all day. The digital world was a unique and interesting place you escaped to for an hour a day. It wasn't a chaos that made you look at your phone for verification codes for everything from paying taxes to ordering a pizza. We also had neon plastic pants, poofy hair, and a community centered around adolescent amphibians with a fascination for pizza. Story 69. The lack of technology. Communication between people was face-to-face, real and honest. The simplicity of the world. Not having to be an adult. Story 70. Because those of us in our early to mid-40s were born in the 1980s but grew up in the 1990s. It was a time when things were exciting for us. We were learning and growing. The music coming out was ours to claim, no longer having to listen to the music from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s that our parents played on the radio. Instead, we listened to the radio to record the newest songs on our cassette tapes at just the right time. We had neon spandex shorts and crazy small butterfly clip hairstyles. We weren't old enough to be too wrapped up in politics, but we were absolutely glued to the television in our middle and high school English classes to watch the O.J. Simpson verdict. We in Florida watched the launches and heard the sonic booms when the space shuttles returned each time. It was an amazing decade, and we miss it with a longing that reminds us of a time when life was much simpler because bullies were in your face and punchable, not anonymous individuals on the internet. We were free to roam the neighborhood and come back only when it was time for dinner. MTV and VH1 actually played music videos. Friends gave us a dream, albeit unrealistic, of living with our best friends in the city and surviving. Saved by the Bell. Yes, I know it premiered in 1989, gave us hope that we'd find love before we graduated high school. And when we started driving, Gas was 96 cents a gallon. Story 71. As a child in the 1990s, my friends and I consumed the same media simultaneously, which gave us something in common to bond over. Today, everyone has their own individual algorithm, and I miss the old days. Story 72. All of life's comforts without the constant targeting and online distractions we have to deal with today. I never thought I'd say this, but parents criticizing you for being out too late, rather than burning books, felt refreshing. Story 73. I was born in 1994. I only got to experience the late 1990s, but I remember really enjoying it as a kid. The biggest thing I remember is cartoons airing every day after school on local television, with expanded cartoon blocks on Saturdays. The internet wasn't a thing, so kids would all be outside playing. Story 74. My parents could afford my childhood home. We are impoverished now, but we were solidly middle class and could enjoy family outings often. We could afford groceries back then, many groceries. The biggest mistake made by our country's leadership was fraternizing with an office intern. Story 75. As a child born in the late 1980s in Middle America, there was a general pervasive irony in everything in popular media, from Kurt Cobain to Weezer, from video games to professional wrestling, and from The Simpsons. This irony was prevalent in youth culture and became more complex and textured through the influence of adults in the 1990s, who grew up amid a wave of countercultural pop culture in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Children played outside in residential neighborhoods without worry about supervision, just groups of kids running freely in the evenings multiple times a week. Then they would go inside to watch wrestling or log on to America Online. Late-night chat rooms? Let's socialize with strangers on the internet? That likely became a cultural tipping point that has transformed into today's social media landscape. Story 76. In my 20s, I rented a cabin with a friend on a quiet lake around 1994, which was my first real place. I woke to the sound of waves. We canoed, smoked cigars, drank whiskey, and made large plates of pasta. One winter night, I woke to a frozen lake beneath a full moon. I read works by Tobias Wolff and Tim O'Brien. I listened to music by REM, U2, and Neil Young on an old 1960s speaker cabinet that sounded terrific. I mourned the loss of River Phoenix and Kurt Cobain. Story 77. Simple answer. They were kids. Almost everyone idolizes their late childhood and teen years. Those who were adults in the 1990s will happily share everything that was wrong. Story 78. I miss when mistakes stayed within your social circle. I don't care how badly you messed up. At least it didn't go viral. I made many mistakes and there is absolutely no evidence. Story 79. It was the last optimistic decade. There were problems, of course, holes in the ozone layer, riots in Los Angeles, and war in the Balkans. However, for the most part, life was comfortable, and the problems didn't seem so insurmountable. Then September 11th occurred, and we have been stuck in a rut ever since. Story 80. It was the last full decade before the world began to change significantly. A historical technological transformation filled with promise. And the contrast to what it has become is disheartening and deeply sad in every way. Story 81. I believe for many millennials, including myself, the 1990s was the time of our childhood and coming of age, so we will always look back on it nostalgically like most generations before and after. This, of course, assumes we had safe and stable childhoods, which sadly too many people did not. That said, it felt like a time of peace, prosperity, optimism, idealism, and hope for the future. The Cold War had just ended, communism had collapsed. The Oslo Peace Accords gave us about 7 years of genuine hope for peace in the Middle East. Apartheid ended in South Africa, and the peace process gained momentum in Northern Ireland. There was a thaw in relations between North and South Korea toward the end of the decade. It truly seemed like the world was thriving and becoming a better place. I do not want to completely sugarcoat the decade. There was dreadful war and ethnic cleansing in places like the former Yugoslavia and African countries such as Rwanda and Burundi. I doubt people there remember that decade fondly. Additionally, poverty, inequality, social injustice, and homophobia were much more prevalent and accepted in mainstream society than they are now. However, for many people living in relatively stable and prosperous conditions, It was easier to focus on the positive aspects, and there was still plenty of good international news to balance out the negative. That does not seem to be the case now. Moreover, the music, culture, and entertainment of that era appeared great in many ways. However, many people may be viewing it through the nostalgic lens of their youth, just as future generations will do for their own. The internet was still new and exciting and had not yet developed the toxicity and negative connotations it carries today. Story 82. The greatest and final frontier of this era's video games is yet to be explored. Until there is a significant leap in technology, everything has been done, and it has been done better. All the setups in the 1990s were either completed near the turn of the century or realized by around 2012. I attribute much of this to the increase in Master of Business Administration graduates. Indie games have a substantial survival bias, but many of them exude authenticity. Story 83. Normal people could afford things like houses and groceries. There was also no internet unless you were a nerd like me, and no social media. Story 84. Great films and music, non-commercial music festivals, and large crowd events where we all looked out for each other. Housing was also 3 to 4 times more affordable, and power bills were not a concern. By comparison, the current situation is quite disappointing. Story 85. Everything wasn't curated. You would take pictures and not know how they turned out for weeks. My friends and I would hang out at the mall, looking absolutely ridiculous in our butterfly clips and glitter, but nobody was posting it online for the world to judge. Story 86. It was a relatively peaceful decade. The economy was strong, technology was advancing, and children were still playing outside and enjoying life. It was like the best of both worlds. Story 87. Nothing people just have nostalgia for a period in their life where they had fewer responsibilities, such as childhood or teenage years, and were not aware of global issues as they are now. Those who grew up in the 1990s are the largest group on Reddit, making them the most vocal. Story 88. Party time. The 1990s was all about having a good time. We worked hard and played hard. I believe we were just more free back then, more relaxed, easygoing, and tolerant. We hadn't yet been affected by the internet, and people with mobile phones often behaved poorly. I would go back to the 1990s in a heartbeat. It was a much better time, and people were just more content. Story 89. I am 58, and I believe people are nostalgic for their childhoods. Everything seems vibrant and wonderful to them. For those with less fortunate childhoods, it was not a better time. Misinformation, HIV, nuclear threats, the Cold War, the Gulf War, no Wi-Fi, slow modem speeds, and comparatively poor video games, alongside limited television channels, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and unopposed racism were prevalent. It was not better unless someone else was covering the less vibrant expenses and keeping up with the news for them. Story 90. Freedom, art, music culture, emerging technology, and the cost of living were all exciting and accessible at once. Story 91. I see many people giving complex answers. The reality is that we were young and carefree, and the memories from those times were enjoyable. Adulthood is stressful, and we often miss the simplicity of our childhood. Today's children will likely look back on their childhoods in the same way. I would like to add that reliving nostalgia isn't always as great as it seems. When I was a child, Surge was my favorite soda. They stopped producing it, but then, within the last decade, they brought it back, and I didn't enjoy it. My tastes may have changed, or I may have just held on to a fond memory of something that wasn't as good as I remembered. I may never know the answer to that, but my point is that nostalgia is usually best left in the past. Story 92. It was a carefree time, more laid back compared to today. Nowadays, you hesitate to share your opinion because everyone seems personally offended. Life was less complicated back then as well. Story 93. The 1990s were the last full decade of the before times. This period marked a significant transformation from the pre-internet age into the age of computing, comparable in importance to the agricultural and industrial revolutions. Currently, we may be experiencing another similar transformation with artificial intelligence. In my opinion, the before times were more wholesome with less harmful information. Story 94. The world changed after September 11, 2001. After that, the world went mad and supported the United States bombing people who never did anything to deserve it. People who knew absolutely nothing about geopolitics displayed support our troops, magnets on their cars and minivans, and you were considered a traitor if you asked, why? It was a big con job, and people were tricked into surrendering their intellectual integrity in a massive hysteria. You are with us, or you are with the terrorists. Story 95. It was a brief pause in geopolitical tensions. Russia had just collapsed and China was not yet wealthy. There was not a constant stream of distressing news to worry about. Story 96. Not paying bills was a plus, but it was a time without social media, where we could experience life without feeling the need to document every moment. We were present in life, and that is a gift in its own right. Not to mention, everything was better: music, movies, and shows. Story 97. Nostalgia is a significant component of our entertainment culture and has been for decades. The 1980s loved the 1950s, the 1990s loved the 1960s, the early 2000s loved the 1970s, and 1980s nostalgia started around 2012. Now, it's the 1990s nostalgia. The reason for this, I believe, is that mass-produced entertainment is marketed to teenagers and very young adults. This is why you'll hear people over 30 claiming that today's music is not as good as what they grew up with. They believe this because the music was once marketed directly to them and is no longer aimed at their demographic. Nostalgia is another marketing tool that aims to engage the over 30 crowd in popular culture consumption. This is why each decade features dozens of movies or television series set about 30 years in the past. Story 98. I lived in a studio apartment in Chelsea, Manhattan, and worked for a publishing company and later a startup. We still enjoyed martini lunches, and no one cared or passed judgment. People were far less judgmental for sure. We had parties and gathered at beaches on weekends, building lives and careers without anything hovering over us. The music wasn't as great as the 1970s and 1980s, in my opinion, and the cars were not as cool. There was just a really happy vibe in the 1990s, like everything was going perfectly. Story 99. The most common online adult demographic likely grew up in the 1990s, so their nostalgia appears more vibrant. Story 100. There is a lot of specific content, such as music. The best way to quantify this is to say that during that time, we believed the world was a good place where individuals could make a difference and envision a bright future. That perspective has mostly changed, and the collective consciousness is becoming more pessimistic, shifting towards a survival mode. Story 101. The number one reason is the rosy-eyed syndrome. All other reasons include the economic downturn of the 1980s, which featured extremely high interest rates, reaching as high as 20%. The 1990s saw these issues getting resolved, and the economy was beginning to recover. Many Generation X, Zennials, and Millennials were in their teens and early adulthood during this time. Times were simpler. Not every piece of news traveled the globe in a matter of minutes. Television media was becoming prominent and more accessible. Home entertainment systems, such as consoles and personal computers, were emerging. The internet surfaced, marking the beginning of a significant economic boom. The prices of oil and gas were low, and interest rates had decreased. The Cold War had just ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. China was emerging from its isolation and joining the global trading system. Story 102. Nothing really, just Generation X and older millennials are having our nostalgia moment. It's the same thing our parents experienced in the 1990s. Nostalgic media, fashion, and memories. Story 103. Lack of constant connection through the internet and smartphones characterized a time of pop culture and hope for the future with the millennium approaching, despite the Y2K scare. However, the events of September 11th significantly shook America's sense of security and safety. This led to increased government surveillance, particularly through the Transportation Security Administration. Following that, the housing market crash of 2008 added to the challenges faced. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.